What would be the fruits of such a system? Not hard to guess. Academic time gets hijacked for radicalization time. So you will have people who have rapidly diminishing academic attainment, academic mastery going way down at the same time that their radicalism goes way up for a set of causes that are particularly bent toward the same politics as the teacher.
Well, welcome back to the Nicki Truesdale podcast. My guest today is James Lindsay. He is my favorite anti-communist, and he's someone who works overtime to expose the Marxist creep in every aspect of our society today. One of the books he's written, which we're going to talk about today, is called The Marxification of Education. This came out actually in 2022, but I think it's very relevant even for homeschool families, and that's what we're going to talk about today. James has written many other things online and in books that all deal with Marxism from many sides. But this book is about, in fact, from the back cover, it says the transformation of education from education to neo-Marxist thought reform follows significantly from the works of a Brazilian Marxist by the name of Paulo Freire, who is little known outside of South America, it was to me, and colleges of education. But in this book, James breaks down the contents and the impact of this disastrous work so you can understand it and hopefully put a stop to it. So this episode might seem out of the ballpark for homeschool families, but it really isn't. All parents, all grandparents, politicians, school board members, homeschool group leaders, they need to understand this because what we're seeing in our society today is not just a perfect storm of things, random combination of things like bad teachers and removing prayer from schools and teachers unions. It really is a carefully concerted effort to change the face of education. And if you've been listening to my series this month, you're already aware of how much Marxism has creeped into every aspect of our society. So I don't mean to be dramatic, but our children are our future. And but when our children are being subjected to this kind of education, we are ripe for the destruction of our republic. And that's the goal. So today's episode might seem like it doesn't apply to you if you're a homeschool parent, but I really want you to pay attention. It's actually not outside our ballpark. It's central to education. It's central to what's happening in our society today. So I've invited James on the show to break it down for moms and dads and grandparents and everyone else who should be interested in education and how it's been affected by Marxism for decades. Welcome to the show, James.
Thank you very much. A very nice introduction.
Thank you. Well, I really do appreciate your work. You've taken Marxist theory, all different kinds of Marxist theory, and made it understandable for the general public, I believe. And so that's what I would like you to do today. I think a lot of people in the audience obviously have heard of critical theory. They've definitely heard of critical race theory. But today we're actually focusing on critical pedagogy. So can you explain what that is?
I mean, we can spend the rest of the podcast explaining what that is. But yeah, let me actually just reiterate something, though, that you said in your introduction for me. And what that is the fact that even if you're outside of the educational system, this is extremely relevant because regardless, you're going to encounter it and your children are going to encounter it. So for a few reasons. Number one, your curriculum's probably already tainted in many cases. So selecting curriculum as the homeschooler is actually going to require you to understand what to avoid.
Yes.
Textbook publishers have been publishing educational materials based on this for a long time, and it's very difficult to find materials outside of that. What we're seeing is, people that are like pretty staunchly conservative are even picking up some of the underlying assumptions. And although they're applying them in a way that's not specifically leftist, they're entering into, beliefs like that you cannot teach any subject in a value neutral way. This is a particular bugbear for me because, I majored in mathematics, as a lot of people know. And people ask me all the time, what drove you out of, the university? Was it going woke? And I was like, man, we did math from the minute we woke up to the minute that we went to bed. My professors were so insane about math, that when I made the mistake of inviting my thesis advisor to my wedding, he told me that he might not be my thesis advisor anymore if I was going to get married, because being married would be a distraction from math.
Wow.
So we did not do social justice. We did not do ideological contamination. We did math. And so I'm pretty well convinced that math can be taught just as math. And in fact, when our professors would make political statements, of their own views or whatever, even in the hallway, we generally thought it was inappropriate. So I think it is actually beyond really basic values like reality exists and we can know something about it. I think it is possible to teach in a largely unbiased way. We can teach history without having to sugarcoat or throw any particular set of colors on the facts to the best of our ability to understand them and what they mean for, whether it's the world at large or our people. But I won't digress, because the other reasons are your kids are like you mentioned before we started, your kids are going to go to college. The colleges are completely steeped in this outside of the hard sciences and increasingly even within the hard sciences. And then most importantly, your kids are going to interact with other children. Mm-hmm. And those other children are being educated by this. So they're going to get the critical mentality that they're getting from their critical pedagogy education is going to leak into your home. So you're going to need to understand how to diffuse that with your own children, which is, somewhat straightforward. But critical theory in general is extremely seductive and extremely tricky in a way. It's like a wholly negative view where all you do is complain that everything's not some imaginary ideal. The really crazy part, I was careful with my wording there, because the really crazy part of this imaginary ideal is you don't even have to have an ideal. All you have to have is that a perfect society wouldn't be like this one. And that's the heart of the critical theory idea. So that's like, for example, with critical race theory, we've all heard the word anti-racism now. Ibram Kendi, you can either be racist or anti-racist. There's no other options, right? What he's doing is basing all of this off of an imaginary vision of a society with no racism in it whatsoever. Well, what does that society look like? Well, they never describe it. They don't know. It's a society that doesn't have any racism in it. So all they do is point to things that they can call racist or that they can script racism into. So what will happen is your kids are going to interact with other kids in the world, or especially as they get older, when they go off to college, who've been fully steeped in this stuff. And when they go to college in particular, but even earlier, you run the risk of them thinking, well, I'm homeschooled, I was sheltered, and now I'm being exposed to all these secret truths about how bad the world is that I didn't know about. And if you aren't preparing them for that, which means understanding how the critical mindset works, you're not going to be able to prepare them for the road that they're going to walk. And of course, homeschoolers understand particularly that the job of parents is not to prepare the road for the child, but prepare the child to walk the road. That's actually why you do what you do. Instead of, say, send your kids to the school and they go yell at the school board, which is trying to change the shape of the road that they're on. So this is really important, even if you're in the homeschooling space, although your kids probably will not be getting, the fire hose blast to the face level exposure through you or your other homeschooling people that you work with. Just to be clear though, like this mindset, as Elon Musk and others have called it, a mind virus. Critical theory is basically a mind virus, has gone like pandemic status throughout all of Western civilization. So there's no interacting with the Western world without thinking this way. I even had this conversation, I know I'm digressing a bit, but I had this conversation the other day just in the context of employment, actually, in kind of high level employment arenas. And the woman I was talking to is, very executive. And she's complaining to me, not to play the generational warfare game, but she's like, millennials, you can't have them. Why? We have to have a group consensus. Everything's going to be done by group decision. Nobody gets to just make an individual decision. We all have to figure out how to come together and work out a, together plan. And we have to take into account all these people's, and these are conservatives, all these people's identities and everything else, and how it all, how everybody in the office feels about it. And she's like, they've all been turned, and she said it, by critical theory to think like this. And so if you don't understand this mindset, like, it's a problem. It's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
So that was a very long not answer to your question, except to kind of give a little color of the critical theory that is the critical theory in critical pedagogy. So, I mean, I know I'm still talking, but new subject. What is actually critical pedagogy? Where did it come from? So critical pedagogy is actually the dominant model. It is pedagogy means, I think most homeschoolers would know this, but pedagogy means a theory and practice of education.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a way that you're going to think about and approach education. Critical in critical pedagogy refers to critical theory, which means two things, or three, I guess, because of the theory and practice thing. But the two things are that the theory and practice of education will be informed by critical theory, and the contents of the education being taught will be informed by critical theory. So, when I think I describe it maybe in the book as infusing critical theory into educational theory. It happens on both levels, at the level of the teacher and at the level of the content, which means that the content is geared toward bringing out this critical mindset that I was just kind of describing in kind of just generic terms, and then that the teaching model itself is geared. This is where you hear things like the democratic classroom, for example. You need a classroom where the students are considered equals to the instructor. And in fact, this is deeply embedded in the critical pedagogy model. But critical pedagogy got its name from a man named Henry Giroux, who was an education theorist who was really coming to prominence in the 1980s. He was a teacher in Rhode Island in the 1970s. He was one of these democratic classroom learning circles, blah, 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 hippie leftist educators. And he was teaching in, I know it's impossible to imagine this scenario right now, but bear with me, times have changed, a significantly conservative school district in Providence, Rhode Island.
Wow.
Yeah, there are no conservatives in Rhode Island any longer in any institutional capacity, but he was teaching in a conservative school district, so his principal didn't want any of this liberal hippie crap in the classroom. He got very frustrated. He literally had been given a copy of Paulo Freire's magnum opus, which is called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. A few weeks earlier, he hadn't opened it yet. He went home furious about his day at school and read the thing from cover to cover, stayed up all night in reading or listening to his descriptions of this moment in his life. It is undeniable that he had a religious conversion experience to critical pedagogy. And so, not to just add too much to the story at once, but that I think is important to understand, that critical pedagogy is in fact religious instruction. It is designed to be religious instruction. Paulo Freire describes it as prophetic, and that its purpose is to build the kingdom of God here on earth. I said Paulo Freire, and I meant Henry Giroux. I'm sorry. Henry Giroux said that about Paulo Freire's work, that it's prophetic and meant to build the kingdom of God here on earth in solidarity with the oppressed. And so why is it religious? Is because Paulo Freire did not design something he called critical pedagogy. He designed something he called education for liberation. And the reason he called it that was because he was deeply embedded in liberation theology. If you don't know what liberation theology is, we have to go a step further back. South America is mostly the hotbed of where liberation theology was brought into being and took off. Paulo Freire being from Brazil, of course. Liberation theology was a KGB, that's the Soviet secret police, or their CIA. The Soviet CIA, the KGB, created liberation theology as a perversion of Catholicism that points toward communism, specifically because they couldn't get Catholics by the direct route. And a lot of times Catholics were faithful enough that they couldn't even torture them out of their beliefs. And so what did they, if you can't trick them into deconverting or changing their faith, if you can't force them or torture them into converting them to communism, what can you do? You take their religion and turn it into communism from the inside. You subvert it. That was liberation theology, and that was the inspiration that Paulo Freire had. So it's not surprising that Henry Giroux, reading his ideas, would describe them as prophetic. In fact, Paulo Freire actually talked about, how the developments within the church and the developments within the school should be operating in parallel. And he called the vision for the church the prophetic church, which would be the liberationist church, the communist church. And so what Paulo Freire did was to create the education for liberation that became the structure, the idea set that was turned into critical pedagogy by Giroux. And Giroux, by the way, is a card-carrying communist. He's openly a communist. And so he wasn't just a liberal hippie. And so what Paulo Freire actually did was to figure out how to, in my opinion, what he created was a Marxist theory of knowledge. So some people are regarded as knowers because they go along with the dominant system, and other people are marginalized and excluded because they won't go along with the dominant system. So they're peasants, they're poor people, they're racially or whatever otherwise oppressed, and that those people have to be educated in a fundamentally different way. The goal of education for liberation, the goal was specifically to use educational material in order to create an awakening to critical consciousness. In other words, he calls it conscientize, Paulo Freire does, but the better word for that in English would be radicalize, or it's awakened to a new consciousness. So born again is the religious analogy, but thought reform or brainwashing is a better way to put it. What Mao Zedong called ideological remorse. So you're like, James, geez, hold on. Mao? We're talking about Mao? Well, in the 10th footnote of the first chapter of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which was Paulo Freire's magnum opus about what became critical pedagogy later, he says that he derives this technique for educating from the successful techniques of Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution. So, yes, this is Maoism repurposed into an educational project where Paulo Freire was talking about literacy in particular for the peasants in the slums in Brazil, in the famous favelas. And so he said that along with actual literacy must come political literacy. To be educated cannot merely mean to be competent at reading and writing and math and so on. It must also include having a political understanding of one's circumstances. And for a Marxist, that means one and only one thing all the time, which is that you have a Marxist understanding. And he said that the purpose of this understanding is to lead people to engage in cultural revolution, and that the cultural revolution must be perpetual, not one cultural revolution and we're done, but one cultural revolution after another, with each stage having an even deeper level of radicalizing consciousness and more education for liberation. So he lays out this theory, and I have a feeling we'll talk about some of the specifics, the generative model that comes from Mao's mass line and so on. He lays this out. Henry Giroux picks it up, mixes it with the critical theorists and some of the postmodernists who went on to create what we now think of as woke. And then another guy who was more directly a disciple of Freire, but also studied under Giroux by the name of Joe Kinchelow, goes on to create a school of thought called critical constructivism, which was he wrote a lot of books, but he had two books in particular. One is called Critical Constructivism, a primer, and one is called Critical Pedagogy, a primer. And so basically one of the guys who wrote one of the key books on what critical pedagogy is and how it's done, Joe Kinchelow, also wrote the book explaining how woke people think. I call it the Book of Woke. I've done 3 podcasts on it on my New Discourses podcast platform. For people that want to hunt them down, just go to my, New Discourses podcast, type in the search Book of Woke. There are 3 podcasts where I read directly from that book, which, by the way, is extremely hard to get. It's more or less out of print. I am very lucky to have been, we'll call it, permanently loaned. We'll see if I ever end up giving it back, a copy of it. But I only know 2 other people who've managed to find one. It's extremely hard to get this book. Okay, so anyway, that's critical pedagogy. It's communist education retooled so parents won't notice it. That's the short version.
That is a good definition. It's so interesting to me how it took me a while when I was reading this book of yours, and I've had to go back and reread some parts because I'm always just baffled how Marxists can take every normal part of life and twist it into something Marxist. But so what they do with education is just divide. It's the same as any kind of Marxism, just dividing us versus them, usually oppressed versus oppressor. And in this case, they did it in education. And I was just baffled by how they do this, because it is hard to read their works. But then when you see it playing out all over society, you realize it doesn't matter how hard it is to understand. It's happening all around us. And that's why we have to understand what they've done. And so they view, as you said, you're always in a revolution. You can only be the oppressed or the oppressor, and you better not be one of the oppressors, or as Marx would say, if we go all the way back to Marx, the landlord or, the bourgeois. We should not be that. You should always be the underdog and always be the oppressed. And that's how students are viewed in this situation. And now we're trying to empower them with instead of teachers, facilitators, instead of someone in power. So can you explain what that looks like in a classroom, a typical public school classroom that's using this model, which is most of them? What does that look like?
I mean, it has a few different manifestations. I think the generative theme is going to be the kind of most important to talk about, but sometimes it's just going to be straight up like what you would consider if you watched it happening, kind of woke preaching. Like sometimes it's just going to be that. The idea behind conscientization or critical consciousness awakening is what that means. The idea behind that is that we all actually live in a false consciousness about how reality works. And in truth, it's actually that there are these very deep and almost invisible systems of oppression that are keeping everybody out of the good life, except for a very small privileged few who are obviously the bad guys. And the idea is that the only reason we don't fight back against them is because we're all asleep. We all have false consciousness. We think that the world works according to various rules, but those rules, like merit, they would say merit isn't actually a measurement of your competence, your ability to do something. It's actually a measurement of your ability to adhere to what the powers that be want you to do and want you to believe, which of course is how they redefine merit. So they like project their broken upside down definition onto their enemies and then make really weird critical theory arguments. So
Yeah.
you might actually just see some of that, right? You might actually just see some of the preaching. But the subtlety and power of the critical, and I should also add, you might also see, the democratic classroom model. Paulo Freire called it the dialogical model, where everybody's in a dialogue together, teacher and student, rather than which he called educators and learners.
Mm-hmm.
He said the educators are more facilitators, like you were saying. The idea is that there's this radical equality across the classroom, and the teacher is kind of just it has this image in their own minds of being, very somehow like Socratic or Dead Poet Society,
Mm-hmm.
like the cool teacher who's just with everybody and brings them into an awakening. But the generative themes method actually gives it away. Like this is not what they're doing. And this is kind of the signature hallmark of the model. And the generative themes method is what Paulo Freire called it, is that there are certain ideas that will radicalize people. This is derived from Mao Zedong's mass line technique, which I can explain in a second. I'll just explain it now, and then I'll come back to the generative model. So the mass line was the idea that the masses had lines out there that they would follow. So the Communist Party would basically survey and find out where the masses have basically dysfunction. Where are they mad? Where are they agitated? Where is there energy that they could use to achieve some goal? And then what they would do is find out what those themes were. I'm trying not to think of any contemporary political examples that are too hot that would get people all bothered. But what they would do is then take that information and then repackage it so that it had an agenda-driven quality to it. And then they would take the line that they derived from the masses and feed it back to the masses with communist coloring on it, in particular to achieve some campaign, typically. So if they wanted to have the socialist high tide campaign, the goal was to increase the level of socialism in 3 years. So they would go talk to the masses, find out what the masses were agitated about, figure out a way to turn that issue into a communist thing, and then say, okay, so what we've identified is that the problem is, this kind of farmer who has too much stuff. So everybody go yell at them and beat them over the head with sticks and turn them into the cadres and whatever else. And so then they would have a huge purge of the wrong kind of farmers in order to increase the level of socialism, which would lead to the collectivization of farms. We'll seize their property and distribute it among the collective, right? And so things like that would be the mass line. So Paulo Freire saw this and was like, well, that works. What we can do is we can find out where the students are emotionally by talking to them, hence the dialogical model. So his like the first day of class in Paulo Freire school would be, let's all just jam. Let's just talk. Let's find out, where are you guys? What are you interested in? What's your life like? And it's this kind of long extended interview process. And since it's Brazilian, God knows how many times they would do that before they would do anything real. But you talk and talk and talk and talk. And the goal was to get them to talk about their problems. You guys look like you don't have a lot to eat. what's up and get them to talk about, being hungry or whatever else. And then literally what Paulo Freire said, it was the educator's job now to go find 17, that was the number he gives, 17 particular themes that the learning environment, the class, provided that are emotional hot button issues for them. And then the educator is to codify them, he said. In other words, he's to transform them into a symbolic representation. So he wanted drawings as often as possible. So if they talked about life in the slum, you would have a drawing of the misery of the life of the slum. And so that's your codification. And so the idea would be that you would teach from the codification, an abstract representation, in other words, of the thing. And the parallelism allegedly to teaching people to read was that a word is an abstract representation of an idea. Right? So one abstract representation representing another. So what he would do is show the picture of the slum, and then he would have them all talk about life in the slum. And while they talked about life in the slum to get them engaged, what he would do is feed to them reasons why life in the slum is actually that way. It doesn't have to be this way. It could actually be that, it could be different. It could be a lot better for you. But look at those rich people over there who don't want you to be considered educated enough to have a good job. Right? Something like that. And so he would feed the Marxist interpretation. This was called decodification. And then eventually, when the class would get agitated enough, he would say, well, this place you live has a word. You know the word, say the word. And everybody'd say favela, and he'd write favela. And then let's break it down and understand what the word means. And his claim was it would make being politically engaged at their emotional hot button resonant issues would make them want to learn more. So he had some kind of like method of actually educating that only works in Portuguese, where you break it down by syllables, and we don't have to get into that. But it had some success, actually. I don't know how much. I don't know how much was exaggerated, but it had some success in the early 1960s in Brazil at getting peasants to learn to read fairly quickly. I don't know how much the radicalism was turned up to 11 yet. So what this looks like in a classroom in, say, the United States today, and I give this example in the book. I've given this example countless times. It never hurts to tell this example again. This is a real example taken from a real teacher training from the real state of Indiana, which is famously, super blue, right? No, not so much. It's not a crazy left-wing state. I mean, it has its problems like all the other 49, but it's not. If I said California, you'd say, oh yeah, of course. Or New York, you'd be like, yeah. But no, this is Indiana. And so this teacher training had the following example. You're teaching second grade math. You're teaching word problems. As a former math educator myself, I know that the point of teaching a word problem is to provide words from which the students are taught to extract mathematical expressions, solve the problem called for by the words. So there's mathematical expressions in the word problem that demand an answer. So you have to figure out which operation. It doesn't say, take 50 and subtract 30. Right. You have to figure out from the context that the problem it's asking you to solve is 50 minus 30. And then you're supposed to express the answer that you get back in words. So here's a classic example. This is the real example, right? So Johnny is riding with his mom and dad in the car on the way to an amusement park. The amusement park is 50 miles away. They have already driven 30 miles. How much further is there to go? So that's why I said 50 minus 30, because that's what you're supposed to teach them to see. Oh, I see. So there's 50, but we've already gone 30. So we're going to take 30 away from how far we've gone. How much is left? What does 50 take away 30 look like mathematically? 50 minus 30. Okay. And so you kind of get the idea. This is how you teach second graders how to do a very basic word problem. Mm-hmm. Now, the thing is that problem that I just said to you is loaded with generative themes, although no parent would ever recognize Marxist content in that question whatsoever. It doesn't even use kilometers. I mean, it's a metric system joke. And so it doesn't even do that. So what you have then is Johnny is riding in the car with his mom and dad on the way to an amusement park. You have 3 generative themes in that first sentence. And the teachers are being taught to focus on the generative themes to increase student interest and engagement. Wow, an amusement park, guys. Who's been to an amusement park? Raise your hand. And now we're talking about 7-year-olds, so the answer is probably some, but not all. In other words, like you said, to lead into all this, there is a difference. There is a line of stratification in the sociological terminology. Okay, so there's a difference in the classroom. There are some haves and there are some have-nots. I have been, I have not been. And then the teacher hijacks the whole lesson. It's no longer about math or word problems. In the guise of being engaged and interested and caring in what the dialogue between she and the student happened to be, she is taught to then go on and say, wow, guys, some of you have and some of you haven't. And she might even add the color. That's not fair. Now we got an emotional word brought into the picture. And in fact, a strong emotion word for 7-year-olds in particular, especially those kids who wish they had been but didn't get to go yet, or who ask their parents and their parents say no. And then she's taught to continue the engaging process, which literally is culturally relevant teaching, by the way. The woman who created that, Gloria Ladson-Billings, literally used Paulo Freire's model and just put critical race theory spin on it and called it culturally relevant instead. Not real creative people here. They don't make new things. They just recycle old things and change the name so first of all, they get credit. And second of all, you don't know that they've stolen something that's communist. Okay, so the teacher's supposed to increase the engagement and says, why would some kids get to go and some kids not get to go? That's not fair. And it's now, kids say the darndest things time. And so the kids start blurting out different answers for why some kids get to go and some don't. And they're supposed to just, nod along. Yeah, that might be, or I don't know about that one, Johnny, or whatever, until somebody says something like, not everybody can afford it. Or like, my parents said that I'm not old enough. At which point you have what's considered under law in all 50 states a spontaneous utterance. Even though it was not spontaneous, you were led to it. It was a leading utterance. But you have a spontaneous utterance from a student that the teacher is now completely within her authority to address and say, wow, you're right. Not everybody can afford to go to the amusement park. How could we change that? And so we've gone into the change agent side of the story. So the idea with the generative themes, and so what were the other two generative themes? Mom and dad. All the feminist and sexual stuff you want is downstream from priming on that one. And then, of course, riding in the car. Is that a good way to go to the amusement park just for fun? Is that good for the environment like we learned in science class? So you've got, at least 5. You could probably fudge critical race theory in there somehow by seeing the demographics of who raises their hand about going to the park. You've got at least 5 or 6 radicalizing political conversations that you can now lead the classroom through dialogically in this kind of back and forth, where you are taking them along the path as the facilitator that you want them to walk, that was laid out by the communist theory you want them to imbibe. Parents are never going to know that it happened. It's not going to be anywhere in anything in writing. If they see your homework problem, it'll never be noticed. It is down to the teacher doing it in the classroom. And if you decide to show up and observe the classroom that day, they're just not going to do it because they know they're being watched and they know it's, sinister. It's how easy it is to get away with it. And so they will use those conversations, as Paulo Freire said, to bring the students into greater consciousness of the social conditions that they find themselves in. In other words, to Marxify them. Hence my title of the book, The Marxification of Education. So it will most often play out that way. All the culturally relevant or culturally responsive or culturally sensitive, all that crap is all downstream from this, not like in this kind of vague sense, as in Gloria Ladson-Billings basically plagiarized them sense, like just took this model and repackaged it in CRT and, about race issues, and said that makes it culturally relevant or culturally responsive. You got to be culturally relevant to the kids in the classroom. Even the kids that object then become the object. And so the idea, like I said, is to find emotional resonance, take them off the lesson, Paulo Freire's exact words are that the academic content is a mediator to political knowledge. So the point is to use the academic content to do politically radicalizing conversations. And one last remark, and I'll let you take back over, is what would you expect? Jesus says, judge them by their fruits. Okay, what would be the fruits of such a system? Not hard to guess. Academic time gets hijacked for radicalization time. So you will have people who have rapidly diminishing academic attainment, academic mastery going way down, at the same time that their radicalism goes way up for a set of causes that are particularly bent toward the same politics as the teacher. And I said that in general because you could do this for radical right views equally as easily as you could do it for radical left. It just so happens, though, that it's radical leftists who've taken over our educational establishment. So it's all going to be basically know-nothing radical left activists who have zero or barely any attainment. So you see stats like that, we have entire school districts where nobody can read on grade level.
Yeah.
We have entire states where it's like less than a third of students can read on grade level. Same for math, same for the other subjects. No academic mastery. But the second there's, a shooting, they're all laying in on the state house steps pretending to have died so that they can do a gun rights demonstration.
Absolutely. That's what I was going to mention. In your book, you talk about this, that the academics are hijacked and kids are just taught to be political activists without even realizing that's what's happening to them.
That's
I
why I call
interviewed,
it the theft of education,
yes,
actually.
absolutely. I interviewed G. Van Fleet a couple of weeks ago, the lady who was born in the Cultural Revolution under Mao and actually moved to the United States in, I think, 1980. And she said she grew up educated under this kind of thought reform. And she said, I was not educated. I realized I couldn't really read. I had a very limited understanding of reading and grammar and math, but I was definitely a communist. And so
Yeah,
that,
one of the most important educational activities in the Cultural Revolution, having read, I know She Van Fleet pretty well also. She and I have worked together. I actually wrote the foreword to her book, but also read Frank de Cotter's The Cultural Revolution. He wrote a history of the Cultural Revolution. One of the key educational goals was basically to have performative memorization of the Mao's Little Red Book of
mm-hmm,
Quotations. And so the kids didn't necessarily know how to read. They just knew how to repeat what was in this book of communist quotes. If you don't know what the Little Red Book is, it's just a book of quotes. It's not a book. There's no argument. There's no plot. There's no any of the trappings of like a book. It's like, A to Z quotes in book form, all of which are by Mao Zedong. And what they would do, so there were kids who could recite the entire thing by memory, but they would do recitations. And basically, if somebody even so much as mispronounced a syllable in Chinese, they'd possibly get beat up or accused of being counter-revolutionary or undermining Chairman Mao, all these things. So it was just all these stupid activities like memorizing his book of quotations instead of like learning anything real. But they did learn how to be a communist. They did learn how to turn in their parents for the wrong kinds of thinking. They did learn how, the saying of the Cultural Revolution put forth by Mao was, to rebel is justified, which
mm.
should ring awfully familiar right now.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is just something you see on TikTok and Instagram, all over the internet, that you've got to just cut off your parents if they voted for Trump, or anyone on the right. I mean, so many kids go into college as normal people and come out as radical leftist activists, and it's not by accident. And their parents are thinking, "What just happened?" And I see with homeschoolers again. Homeschool kids grow up under pretty normal circumstances, and then they go to college, and they were not prepared for the radicalization that happened, and the parents were certainly not prepared for it because they didn't see what's happening, that the professors are this way. And even if they were homeschooled all the way through, they were not prepared for the activist mindset that not only the professors have, but every other person in their school has.
Yeah, everybody other student is such a big deal. I just actually I can't remember if I read this or if I actually talked to somebody. Oh, I read this. I know where I read this. I read this in John Rauch's book, The Constitution of Knowledge, which is an interesting book. I feel bad because I like John and I get along with John pretty well. But disclaimer, John has the worst case of TDS like ever. So reading his book is a little challenging because he throws in barbs at Trump like a lot. He talks about how like the Russia thing was fake, and that's really funny to read it now. It's really funny to read it now. But anyway, the book is really good aside from his TDS, which leaks through a lot. But anyway, I'm reading it and he's talking about, so he wrote this, he published it in 21. I assume he wrote it in 20. And he's talking about all these interviews he did with college students, talking about through the foundation called FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which is a civil rights advocacy group for campus, and in particular free speech issues. And so one after another, he relates. He only gives a couple of examples, but he says, he talked to so many students, college students right now, who said that they came to college because they thought they were going to be able to have arguments and discuss and their thoughts and blah, blah, blah. And they just realized that there's no upsides. That's the phrasing, no upsides to trying to go against the grain whatsoever. So within a few months, they just shut down. They just shut up head down and go with the flow, best case scenario. So now you have this self-censoring, which PS means self-loathing and depressed, because being unable to express yourself and knowing that you wish you could is one of the most demoralizing situations you can be in. That's your best case scenario on college right now. And it's not just the professors who will shut you down in class
Right.
if you and embarrass you in front of other people. It's that all the other students are that way too. And so like these students said, no upside whatsoever. Now that may have changed. A lot has changed since 2018 through 20, when I assume he did those interviews, in terms of the temperature about woke. So that probably has changed somewhat, but this is a very serious circumstance to find yourselves in. This is the kind of thing that is described in psychological analyses of what would have happened under Mao's regime, say by Robert Lifton, in writing, say, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. He says that one of the key features of this kind of a circumstance, Mao's tyranny he's talking about, or a totalitarian system, is what he calls milieu control. So the entire environment is controlled. There's only one very narrow set of opinions and views that are allowed. And this will brainwash many people by its own social forces, and it will completely break psychologically, depress, etc., people who have a little more integrity, but still are subject to it and just get defeated. And it's a very, very rare student who can retain a healthy mindset through this. And I just reiterate what I said earlier about how seductive these critical models are. And I think that's a particular warning for kids with homeschool parents, because it's very likely they haven't heard these things before. So now it feels like everybody, including my parents and my church, has been lying to me. Like, you guys, it's very easy for them to start to accuse you of having put them in the Truman Show their entire lives. And this whole wider world of truth is out there that you didn't want them to know. And then how do you think they're gonna turn on you? They're
I
gonna
see
blame
it all
you.
the time.
Yeah, it happens a
It's
lot.
very common for, there's a group of Christians that deconstruct their faith. There's also this group of homeschoolers that grew up homeschooled, and now they're sort of deconstructing being a homeschool kid because of that. And that's what I think is the danger, that parents are not aware of what's going on. And if they were, they could prepare their kids and say, here's what the world is going to say. Here's what you'll see on TikTok here. Yes, I want to show you this so you understand what everybody's saying. And then I want to help you understand why this is a bunch of garbage. One of the things that you said, I don't remember where, but is that in the eyes of the critical pedagogy, for example, truth doesn't actually exist. It's all about the narrative.
That's right.
And that's why you hear things like, it's your truth, or we're interested in lived experience, and not necessarily historic fact. Even the stupid thing about 2 + 2 = whatever you want it to equal, because, so let's say a white male said it equals 4. Maybe we don't believe that white male, so we're going to say whatever we want to say. And it's not, it sounds like a funny joke, or it sounds like something we can just make fun of on the right, but it's real. This stuff is all over the place. And then you talked about counter narratives too, somewhere, I think on one of your podcasts, and I see this specifically in homeschooling with book lists and homeschool curriculum, where, let's say, talking about Plymouth Plantation, well, we don't really want to hear just what the Pilgrims had to say. We want the Indian side of it too. Well, it's a little harder to do when those people didn't have a written history, so their narrative is sparse at best, but we do have the story from some pretty upstanding people who were all about character and honesty. The same thing with George Washington. I used to follow the Mount Vernon Facebook page until it just became all about the enslaved. And so every single post was like, we're going to tell this history from now on only from the viewpoint of the people who were enslaved at Mount Vernon. Well, it's okay to know all sides, but they're just flipping it completely to the other side.
Yeah, a friend of mine just went to Monticello, which is Thomas Jefferson's home. And if I remember the story right, so I might be embellishing a little bit, but I don't think so. But the gist that I came away with was that, the guides were there. And from the very beginning, it was welcome to Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson, America's third president and owner of, however number of
How
whatever
many
slaves.
slaves? Yep.
That's it. That was the first thing they said. Not any of the other stuff, just America's third president, no Declaration of
There was
Independence.
a lot of other stuff.
You
Yeah,
know,
in 2020, I have not forgotten this. In fact, I don't ever delete emails, so I went and dug this back up. But one of the homeschool curriculum companies who's very conservative Christians, obviously you would think pretty trustworthy in getting us some good source materials for our homeschooling history. This was in 2020. They sent out an email and said, we've made some updates to our early American history. And what they did was change the book list for kids to read. These are just books you can go to any library and get, but they changed what they recommended. And just for one example, the story of Lewis and Clark is now going to be about Sacagawea. Well,
mm-hmm.
She didn't play a huge role. She played a role, but she did not play the role. But this is what the book list changes were all about changing it from whoever was the central part of the story to if it was a Black person or an Indian or, some maybe just a woman, whatever that was, that was how they changed it. And back then, before I even understood what you talk about in your book, I was like, what are they doing?
Well, what they're doing is generative education. So what they're doing
Exactly.
is they're pushing this idea, and the goal is to get the student not to, mull over how they can make an amusement park affordable for everybody, make the government pay for it.
Yeah.
The goal is now to get them to ask the question, why wasn't I told the real truth?
Yes.
What else have I not been told? And then
Mm-hmm.
they can lead them breadcrumbs down the, oh, well, the white cis heteronormative power structure
Mm-hmm.
doesn't, or capitalist power structure doesn't want you to know a lot of these things,
Mm-hmm.
because it would undermine the narrative, because it's all narratives, the narrative that you've been told about American history, and get you to doubt some of the,
Mm-hmm.
shining city on a hill beliefs that you have. So the
Mm-hmm.
goal there is, of course, to make it so it's harder and harder and harder. They tell some cute and positive story in order to raise the question of why is this sidelined, in order to lead you down a road that ends in maybe my country wasn't so great,
Mm-hmm.
right? Maybe America's not that good of a place,
Mm-hmm.
which obviously goes steps further to like F America, and
Mm-hmm.
this is a fascist country, and blah blah blah, and you have your full blown revolutionary. And what they're tapping into is the kinds of questions that everybody ends up having as they go through, historical education in particular. There are these things that are hard to figure out. How did Thomas Jefferson write all men are created equal and yet have slaves? How did he do this, right? And it actually takes quite a bit of kind of wrestling with Thomas Jefferson and the
Mm-hmm.
time that he was in and the thought that he had and the conflict that he internally kept about this issue, to start to have a mature view, which includes that, well, he was in Virginia at the end of the 18th century. Like, that's not a trivial detail. He was participating in the institutions of his time, not separate from them, and like this enlightened being that fell down from the stars to get everything right, and which is not the kind of standard that you should be having for historical figures anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And so it takes a lot of time. I can remember going through, not in some angry way, because I actually had, normal teachers growing up, but I can remember going through those kinds of questions, having those kinds of conversations with
Mm-hmm.
my equally uninformed idiot friends. And what they're doing is hijacking that development of maturity about
Mm-hmm.
complicated and sometimes ugly issues, and hijacking it into a form of hatred for one's country through very definitive, very polarizing, very black and white moral coloring that it's very easy to fall into when you're a young and idealistic
Mm-hmm.
person. It's a very dangerous situation. And if you don't understand how the critical model works, I mean, the republic is at risk, because if the next generation doesn't believe in it, and right now that looks to be largely the case, then why will they continue doing it? And they won't.
Right. There's definitely a minority now of people who do love their country, that do love America, while recognizing that we are not perfect, but still one of the best things to happen to the world in my opinion. And a
Yeah,
lot of,
unequivocally the best
yes.
country that's managed to come into being.
And I think somewhere you said something about the goal here is to denounce the existing world and always to usher in revolution, which you've said many times. And I've seen you say this on Twitter, I don't know how many times, that the issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution. So they don't care what the issue is. It could change tomorrow. And there's so many. It's it's the gender roles, the T stuff, climate, whatever. I learned in the book that you did, Cynical Theories, I'd never heard of research justice and citation justice. Like, it's so ridiculous how many ways they apply this to every aspect of society.
It's
Fat
like
studies. Oh my goodness.
it's like we have a giant constellation in the night sky that's a hammer and sickle to represent communism, and it's
Yeah.
made up of a bunch of stars, so they can grab
Mhm.
whichever star they want now, and when it's not bearing fruit anymore, they can switch to a different star in the same constellation, but it's still communism. So what you just were talking about, it's all there in Paulo Freire. So you said, I
Yeah.
said that's about denouncing the present world or
Mhm.
the world itself, actually. And I would just want to underscore for your listeners who probably haven't read the book yet or don't know Paulo Freire that he actually says that, right?
Mhm.
So he says that the process of what the point of his education for liberation is to be a creator of the world. And the way you become a creator of the world is by denouncing the existing world and announcing the possibility of a different world. Now notice how that works, because everything about critical theory is contained in that. You denounce what is, you do not announce something new. You announce the possibility of something new,
Yeah.
right? So they at no point ever have to argue for the virtues of their system, how or why it's going to work, any of that. You denounce the current system and announce that there's an alternative, but you never have to fill in the blank as to what the alternative looks like. And if you
Mhm.
do, well, that's just more oppression. That's just you want me to describe it on your terms, which are already captured by the system. So I
Yeah.
can't and I won't. You think, well, that sounds ridiculous. James, why would you say that about them? That's a straw man, right? No, the guy who created the critical theory, his name is Max Horkheimer. He was one of the Frankfurt School cultural Marxists, or critical Marxists, if you want. He was director of the Frankfurt School at the time that he created the critical theory in a book or essay, depending on how you want to categorize it. It's about 75 pages long. Is it a book or an essay? Whatever you want. But the book is called Traditional and Critical Theory. And I might have said that backwards. It might be critical and traditional theory. I always get it mixed up, but it doesn't matter. It's one or the other. You can look it up. And so in this idea, he defines this, and then later he's asked in an interview, why did you come up with the critical theory? Could you explain what that was all about? And he said, yeah, so a couple of things. First, Marx believed that capitalism was going to immiserate the worker, but it turns out it
Mhm.
doesn't. It allows the worker to build a better life. And so that's why I devised the critical theory. So it was that Marx was incorrect about his theories, but we wanted to continue the project. And so he says the critical theory was invented on the idea that it is not possible to describe an ideal world on the terms of the present society, but we can criticize those aspects of the existing society that we wish to change. So again, you denounce the existing world, and then you announce the possibility of a new world, although you never have to actually argue for it. It's
Just stay
literally,
aggravated all the time.
if anybody out there with the homeschooling has their kids listening, it's like, then they're teenagers, it's literally the trust me bro of politics. Everything's bad, give me the power, trust me bro, it'll
Mhm.
be better.
Mhm.
That's it. They don't have actually a plan. Their plan is to take power. And then when they have power, by Paulo Freire's reckoning, what's necessary is to start the whole process over again and destroy the thing there. So the people who take power think they're going to be sitting pretty, and they might be for a very short time, but then the Cultural Revolution eats them next. And you get a new power that the Cultural Revolution eats next. It is a system of grinding your society into the dust, is what it actually is. And that's actually what he describes as what conscientization means, denouncing the existing world to announce the possibility of something different or a new world. And he says this is a world creating or world building. He literally describes it in religious language. It's quoted in the book. I don't have the quote to memory right now, but it's something very much like, that you have to learn to speak the word in order to speak the world, or something like
Mhm.
that. So it's got the
Mhm.
Genesis, speak the world into existence kind of godlike power, which
And
is
you also mentioned that
pretty
he talks about
frightening.
it being an Easter, like a new
Oh
Easter.
yeah, He literally says that the role every educator has to go through is a personal Easter where you die to your old bourgeois self and are resurrected on the side of the oppressed,
Mm-hmm.
and that you must experience this. And then he says that the Easter of the Christian calendar is, in fact, just commemorative rhetoric and a date on the calendar. It's not real. It doesn't have anything. That's dead and gone, and with no hope of being resurrected, is the exact wording he uses to talk about that. And so you have exactly what you were just saying. I did a podcast about Paulo Freire, God, 2 years ago or more, 3 years
Mm-hmm.
ago, around when I was doing this book, I'm sure. And it's called How Paulo Freire Made Marxism Dumb. And so the other piece that you mentioned is like how there's always another issue, right? There's always another issue. And I said that constellation thing, but it's worse than that. What the generative themes method does, if we were to take it out of the classroom and down to the individual, right? So it's individual tutoring through critical pedagogy. You would interview one student to find 17 things that drive them crazy, and you would milk them on 17 issues relevant to themselves. So what Paulo Freire did was, it's no longer about economics or even sex or gender or race, although all of those can be plugged in. It's about being able to make a Marxist analysis of literally anything that bothers you at the individual level,
Mm-hmm.
which can all then be cobbled together into this intersectional framework through these avenues of race, sex, gender, sexuality, whatever else, and brought into the constellation of communism that we were talking about before. So it doesn't matter what bothers you. You learn in the critical pedagogy method that anything that's not going your way is the fault of a system that's making sure it doesn't go your way. And they can, but don't have to, come up with crazy arguments about how to attach it to economics, because it could be colonial status, national status, race, sex, gender, sexuality, fat status, body, immigration, just down the list, or some of
Mm-hmm.
them, or all of them all at once, or if it's none of them, just make up a new theory. There's
Mm-hmm.
nothing to stop you. And so,
It's thought reform, literally
yeah,
thought reform.
but it's also, it's like, we talk about the internet being like the democratization of publishing. So when we were, it's like a book was a big deal because you had to get an agent, you had to get a publisher, somebody had to publish your book. I remember when I was in college for a philosophy class on a lark, I wrote like 100-page long paper. So I went through the whole process of getting it printed and binding it in the school bookstore, and I had written a book, right? I was all proud of myself. It was really stupid, I think, but I had done that. But like, I had to go to the school bookstore, and it had like spiral binding down the side. Like, to get a real book was a thing. Now you can literally be a broadcaster in 4K
Mm-hmm.
from your iPhone on your couch.
Mm-hmm.
You need absolutely no special equipment beyond your cell phone and an internet connection, which virtually everybody in the West has. So you can sit on your couch, and literally, some people have what amounts to viral television shows.
Mm-hmm.
Well, high viewer count, high ratings, as Trump would say. Look at the ratings. High rating internet television show
Mm-hmm.
from your house. Anybody can do it, right? So you have democratization of this, right? So what Paulo Freire actually did, that's a broadcasting or publishing on your blog or on your social media. I don't know anybody that knows this anymore, but if you read the original filing for the concept of Twitter when they were, making it as a company, the original concept was micro blogging. So every tweet or post is actually a blog.
Wow.
It's actually a blog post in terms of its original conception. So it was microblogging was the idea behind it, right? So that's democratization of publishing, democratization of broadcast. Paulo Freire created democratization of Marxist antagonism.
Hmm.
You didn't have to figure out how to fit it into the economic framework or even racial framework or any other framework. You can fit it into any framework whatsoever that you want. And so the complete democratization of complaining is what he, like in the critical theory sense,
Mm-hmm.
with the intent to denounce and destroy the existing world, is what he did. So he decentralized the ability to do Marxism. And a lot of people like haven't quite grasped what this means. But in metaphor, if we think of it as a mind virus, it's the virus got out of the lab.
Mm-hmm.
There is no wet lab anymore, or whatever it's called. There's no more Wuhan Institute for Virology involved here in this virus. In the wild and in every single person, it can make a new variant.
Yeah. That's why we see it not just in education, it's in corporations, it's in entertainment, it's all over social media.
That and lots and lots and lots of money, just to be a little prosaic but real about it.
That's true. But like you said, even for someone who's homeschooled and let's say maybe they don't go to college, but they go straight into a workforce situation, they're still going to encounter all of this because
Yeah, HR is
corporations are
coded in terms of
practicing.
it.
Yeah. And then of course their coworkers are very likely were educated in this very mindset. And so you don't have to be brainwashed to still deal with the brainwashing. And like you said earlier, it's very appealing. It's easy to get people drawn into this because it plays on emotions and feelings. And so people start to put aside their common sense when they hear, oh, that's not fair, which is at the basis of pretty much all forms of Marxism. That's not fair. And then they get pulled in easily. And I think that's how Christians get pulled into it, which you talk a lot about, the conservatives. We won't even go down the woke right rabbit trail on this podcast, but I've seen you talk about it and I've seen the evolution of this just happening in front of my eyes. And it's amazing to me how people don't recognize what they're doing. But
Yeah, Christians have been pulled into it a lot. It turns out that, like I said, the whole educational model was derived out of liberation theology. So
mhm,
basically, what Paulo Freire was doing was taking communism posing as Catholicism. Then you
mhm,
imagine if that had a Sunday school and then he just made it secular.
mhm,
So same
yeah,
exact programming, just not in the religious language. Although I bet you he used a lot of religious language if you think about it, because he writes Pedagogy of the Oppressed, finishes it in Portuguese in 1968, does not publish it. It gets published first in English in 1970, and then it's translated back into Portuguese later.
oh wow,
I don't know why, or maybe it was his original that got published later, but it was published in English first in 1970, though he finished it in 68. But in 1968, he was also invited to give a 2-year lecture series at Harvard about his
mm,
educational model. Now, at this point, he's been kicked out of Brazil. He got a new government came in 64, I
mhm,
think. Don't quote me on that exactly. My history of Brazil is not my strong academic suit, but it's 64, 65, something like that. A new government takes over. It is vaguely right wing and dictatorial, doesn't like this communist Paulo Freire doing his stupid education program anymore that the government was letting him do, and actually kicks him out of the country. So he flees to Bolivia, and they figure out he's a Marxist, and they kick him out too, also in the same year. I think this is 64. He flees to Chile, and then who does he take up with? Some priests in the liberation theology tradition
okay,
who then school him. Then he writes his book. So then he goes off to Harvard. He's invited to speak at Harvard for 68 in 68 for 2 years, but he doesn't stay
Lord,
there. He actually only takes 6 months of the appointment at Harvard, and then he leaves from the United States, from Boston. He goes to Geneva, where he had been recruited at the same time for a second thing, which was a 10-year appointment to work for the World Council of Churches that was coming into existence. So he
wow,
actually spent 10 years in Geneva working at the World Council of Churches and blew off most of his Harvard opportunity to be able to do it. So there's strong reasons to believe that he probably did actually use explicit religious, language. But the
mm,
thing is, like, love thy neighbor. We all saw how that got twisted against Christians during the pandemic. It's been twisted against Christians with the idea of leaving the southern border
right,
open.
immigration,
You hear it all the time, like the guy on the other side of that razor wire is your brother too. It's
mhm,
like, yeah, that's fine. He's my brother spiritually, and guess what? He's also a Mexican.
mhm,
He's on the other side of the line. There's a port
mhm,
of entry where he can attempt to come legally right there if he would like. And what really loving your neighbor as yourself would be is, I don't want to see you get arrested or find yourself in trouble. So do it the legal way. And
mhm,
if I can help you, I will, but you're going to do it the legal way. And if you don't qualify because you happen to be, I don't know, in the Chinese military or something, then maybe you're not going to get through. Right. And so, because then you're also loving your own countrymen as neighbors too.
mhm,
And so, these values are easily twisted. I mean, it's very famous that, what was the line? Jesus was the first socialist, right? I
right,
don't remember if that was cooked up in liberation theology or the social gospel, which was the Protestant version that actually came about a lot earlier. In fact, it preceded the Soviet Union. It came from British socialists, so-called English socialism, or IngSoc,
mm,
as it were, came up with this idea of the social gospel and unleashed it through Walter Rauschenbusch in 1905 in New York City. took off on the Baptist left. He was a Baptist. So the Baptists got eaten up through the early part of the 20th century, the progressive era, with this rampantly progressive so-called social gospel, which any Christian reading, any biblical Christian reading this would be aghast, right? So it turns out that it's really easy to turn the knobs on these Christian values without full discernment of what they actually require, and get Christians sucked into this kind of a socialistic or communistic mentality. So it's doing that, of course, now with our society on our liberal values. Every man, we believe that all men are created equal. So what's the title of Robin DiAngelo's book? Is it sitting right here? I don't think it is. Robin DiAngelo has this book. It's the book that opened up woke to me to be able to explain. I call it Woke for Dummies. And it's called Is Everyone Really Equal? She wrote it in 2012. A lot of people haven't heard it. It's an education book. It's not her later white fragility stuff. Mm-hmm. So like they are able to pick at these values. So it can be with Christian values they can pick at. It can be with American values or liberal values they can pick at. And I don't mean liberal like Democrat. I mean liberal like Thomas Jefferson. And they can do this with any society. It's not just that they're inflaming guilt. They can take your own values and turn them inside out against you. And they're very, very, very good at it. The Soviets bragged. And in fact, it was well recognized that the Soviets had an unbelievable capacity for this. Probably if you were to scale like the, skill and ideological subversion from like 1 to 10, the Soviets were like literally an 11. They were really good at it. So they can twist Christianity. And I think that was through this thing through Paulo Freire, part of how they were able to actually tap the American value system is that they went through our profoundly deep Christian sensibilities, not because Christianity waned, but because biblical literacy was low, which is not the same thing. There are a lot of people who were pretty serious Christians who just didn't know their Bible very well. It's not quite, it's nothing to do with their faith.
Talk about literally all the time. You have to know the Bible so you understand the counterfeits.
I'm watching, we're not going to talk about woke right specifically, but I'm watching on left with this social gospel type stuff, to use a term for it, or liberation theology type stuff. And on the right with all this kind of weird nationalistic radicalism that's happening. I'm watching in both cases. It's like the only Christians I'm seeing that are staying clear-headed are the ones that I know read their Bible regularly and take it very seriously. And I'm not picking on Christians because a lot of other people outside of Christianity are getting rolled too in both one direction or the other. Nobody's getting rolled in both directions at the same time, I don't think. It gets complicated when we get to Israel. No one knows for sure. But it does. It's having literacy, whether in your fundamental values, which is the same problem that American classical liberalism has suffered, which is that we had a lot of people who were taking it for granted, running on autopilot, just assuming that their freedoms are kind of guaranteed, and had forgotten how to defend them, had forgotten that not only how to defend them, but that they have to be defended one generation after another after another. You cannot rescue liberalism this generation and then have a time to coast. It doesn't work. Every generation has to make the arguments again, because people who want to steal your freedom never go away. Always going to be people who want to rule over other people. And so you always have to have people who can articulate it. So Christians who were faithful, and nothing bad about that. I'm not going to be one of these guys who beats on people. If you're going to be a Christian, you got to read the Bible really carefully. I get it, man. Life is tough. But you do to really understand it, or else what's going to happen to you is your values will get turned inside out and used against you because you don't know them well. You vaguely know them and value them, which is an extremely dangerous place to be. And the same thing, look at the language of the left with regard to whether it's abortion or whatever other issue that they push on. And this it doesn't matter whether even you could be pro-choice and listening to this. It's not that you have to be pro-life to understand the problem, that the left is considering it a fundamental right because it's been something that they have been allowed to do under the Roe versus Wade legal doctrine. But that doesn't make something necessarily a fundamental right, right? And so they're using this language of fundamental rights and appealing to things off of education as a fundamental right. That's closer to the subject that we're talking about today. Therefore what? So apparently it's got to be run by the United Nations and teach all kinds of crazy globalist stuff or something, education for sustainable development, because education's a human right. That's actually SDG 4, I think, in the Sustainable Development Agenda. So you get this language of rights. Well, what this is people not actually understanding what it means to have rights, inalienable rights, or what those rights are. And furthermore, they talk in terms of not just rights, but they talk in terms of liberty, right? I should be allowed to do basically whatever I want. And well, that is kind of the classically liberal definition or idea of negative liberty. But the deal is that the raw deal, it's a raw deal. If you want to go full libertine or whatever it is that you want to go, is that you can have all the liberty to do what you want and no liberty from the consequences of your actions. So when you go do something stupid, like, in this case, have uncareful sex and end up pregnant, you still have to you have to take responsibility for the situation that occurred. A lot of conservatives mess that up, by the way. They're like, do the crime, do the time. And it's like, it's not necessarily a crime, right? You have to take responsibility for the circumstances and reality that arise from the choices that you make. So if you decide to, act irresponsibly, you are actually within your rights to do that. You are perfectly free to go act as irresponsibly as you want, so long as you are also willing to shoulder the burden of the problem that you create. If that happens to be like that you're driving recklessly and crash your car or damage property or hurt somebody else, you can expect a gigantic lawsuit in front of you, for example. Because you're going to have to take, to the degree possible, the responsibility that comes with it. It would be better if you were responsible ahead of time instead. And so liberty doesn't demand responsibility, but that's the other side of the coin, because you're going to have to take responsibility for your mess is the idea. You're not supposed to have the irresponsible life with the government swooping in and picking you up like the eagles coming to snatch Frodo out of Mordor, right? The eagles don't get to come. Like if you put the ring in the fire and the lava comes, like you got lava, baby. That's the idea. So they have this, my point was they have these values, right? They care about the ideas of liberty, but they don't understand them. And it's the same thing when Christians care a lot about the values of their religion. It's very important to them, but they don't understand it. So they don't have the discernment. I mean, I don't know what they warn about the most in the Bible. I haven't done one of these kind of comparisons, but I know it is warned about. I think it is actually true that it's warned about in more books of the Bible than almost anything else, which is to watch out for false teachers. It comes up over and over and over and over again. How on earth, dear Christian, would you watch out for a false teacher? You would know your Bible, because then you'll know if their teaching is false. So people, get worked up about me. They're like, well, James isn't Christian, and there he is talking about the Bible. How is that a threat? If you know your Bible, then every Christian who knows their Bible is not going to be misled by me, and they might have the opportunity to correct me, right? And then I learn, and then they have the opportunity or whatever. And so, like, it's not a threat to have somebody who doesn't know the Bible doing this to people who know it. But when they don't know the Bible, one of the things that the communists said, this is in Paul Kenger's book called The Devil and Karl Marx, is that Paul Kenger's a very good read if you're interested in this kind of thing.
Yes, he's one of my favorites.
One of the things he says, I think he has almost a whole chapter about this, is about how communists particularly mocked Christian pastors and said that they were the biggest suckers of them all. It was so easy to flip them around. Actually, Hitler said this too. Hitler actually commented that one of the reasons Christianity, in his view, was terrible was because Marxism was just basically a perversion of Christianity. So it latches onto the Christian mindset very easily. And so this is one of the reasons Hitler's conclusion wasn't read the Bible. It was to get rid of Christianity and be a Nazi. But this was one of the reasons that he hated it, was because Marxism, he gets into calling it Jewish and all that. So Christianity ultimately came from the Jews, and then the Jews took it back and twisted it into Bolshevism, is what he says, and used it against the people of the world. That's Hitler's view. But he's saying this in the context is that he doesn't like Christianity because it can be exploited by Marxists so easily. And Marxists were something he was not particularly fond of, except to steal all their ideas and use them for his race program, which he also said he was doing.
Well, I want to share, I think this was, I don't remember, this is in one of your podcasts where you were talking about people asking, what do we do? And basically your answer was to get more educated, which is the point of this episode today, get more organized and spread the information at the very least. Understand what's happening. Do something about it, whatever that looks like for you. And so I think even if you're just a homeschool mom or dad, or you're a grandparent that's concerned, get the information, understand what's happening, and at the very least help your kids, whatever age they are. This is easier with maybe middle school and high school. Help them to understand what they're seeing everywhere, whether they're on social media or watching entertainment, on TV, movies, books. Children's books are just full of this stuff now, even though they may not even go to a public school. Help them to see what they're seeing all around them and give them the tools to resist being drawn into this mindset, this, like you said, the woke mind virus. It is a virus. And then if you have the capability or the desire, do more. Get involved with a group or start a group that helps to spread the word even more, or educate people. Read this book that James wrote, The Marxification of Education. It's very enlightening. And if your kids are not being homeschooled, obviously that's what I'm going to recommend. Get them out of public education. Prepare them. If they're going to go to college, prepare them to be ready to see this and to fight it. Calling your congressman generally doesn't get you anywhere. Speaking at a school board meeting for 3 minutes, we've seen the results of that. Even if states like Texas has passed laws to outlaw DEI and things like that, it doesn't happen because, like James said, they can take a normal math word problem and turn it into a Marxist lesson. And it's not in the textbook. You're not going to see it in the homework. It's what's happening in the classroom, and it's not written on the instructions of the sheet. So just like Common Core was apparently once outlawed, it still exists under constantly changing names. DEI is still in existence in every school and every university, many corporations. It just keeps changing names. So if the teachers are being trained to think this way and to teach this way, let me just tell you, there's no such thing as a good school. Every school is affected by this in some fashion. Doesn't matter what they say the grades are, how high the students are scoring. If your Sunday school teacher is also a public school teacher in your little tiny small town, none of that really matters because this thing is widespread. So get your kids out of the public school. And if you've already done that, educate yourselves, educate your teenagers, prepare them for all aspects of society to be inundated, to just be saturated with this virus, and teach your kids to identify it. James, do you have anything else to add to this before we close?
Yeah, I'll just add, based on what you just said, the three most important things that you want to have, cultivate, work on, share with your kids. The three most important things I think right now are discernment, courage, and family. I'll just very briefly touch on each. We just talked about discernment. You have to know what you're dealing with, which is why you've got to get educated. You've got to know your own beliefs, whether that's American values, whether that's, if you're faithful, most of you probably are, you need to know your Christian values correctly. So you need to have your Bible studies. You should probably have something like a reading group, if you can set it up, not for just kids, they can come too, but for adults too, better of both actually, where you're looking at American founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and going through what were the debates, what was going on, even the Anti-Federalist Papers to a degree, to understand, although those are harder to follow. They're a little bit messier, but to understand. And even if you want, you can go into some of the philosophical underpinnings of, the tradition. We could look at Edmund Burke. You could look at John Locke, not to take these people as saints, of course, but these are places, Montesquieu, de Tocqueville, on and on, Adam Smith, looking at some of this historical material, but especially the values of your religion, your faith, but also your American civics is going to be foundational to being able to have the discernment not to get pulled into error. And then courage, because the crowd is going into error with you or without you. And so you're going to have the courage to do the work and then to stand against the crowd sometimes, to do the right thing when it's easier to do something else. That takes courage. To take your faith and put it into action takes courage. And you don't always know if it's going to work out. You are always trading some other opportunity that you could be having. You could be skipping the amusement park to have your, Thomas Jefferson hour or whatever. And so this takes courage. And then family I don't need to preach to you about family or what family is. I don't think, if you're homeschoolers in particular, but I want to talk very briefly about what Robert Lifton's book, thought reform and the psychology of totalism. The structure of the book, very briefly. He's a psychologist in the history. He was a psychologist in the early 90s who ended up in Hong Kong and by chance ends up meeting people that were getting thrown out of Mao's regime at the beginning. So the very early 90s, they weren't locking the country of China down yet. They would try to brainwash you, and if they couldn't get you to change, they would exile you. And first, what they would do is put you on a boat that goes to Hong Kong, and then you're not their problem anymore. And so off to Hong Kong he was in Hong Kong. And so he found this so intriguing after talking to a couple of people that he got a grant to stay for a year and a half. So he stays and he interviews person after person after person. And broadly speaking, the book is, a little bit of his ideas and then a lot of interviews with people. And then occasionally, and especially at the end, a summary of the kind of psychological theory that he has regarding what was going on in China at the time. And the book doesn't get published until like 61. So it's like kind of a lot later. He's had a lot of time to think about it and work on it. But there are two broad kinds of people that he's interviewing, not to oversimplify. People who were not Chinese, like foreigners who got kicked out, and people who were Chinese who either got kicked out or escaped. And the primary thing that shows up again and again and again, reading these horrifying stories of the Chinese nationals that got ejected or fled, is what kept them from breaking and becoming a Chinese communist, which was the goal. Obviously, they wanted the foreigners out if they could get them out anyway, so it's a different story. But with the Chinese nationals, what the story was is it was their family. They thought about how much they would, hurt their family to give into this stuff, to change their values. So those values that you share, those memories that you share, how you impress your kids and your nieces and nephews and so on, your relations, to use an old Southern word, is actually an anchor that can help them not fall off the cliff when they get into these situations. So I encourage people to be very intentional about family, but the discernment and the courage have to be there. They're not going to look up to you if you're a coward, and so you're not going to build a very good anchor. And if you're not discerning, you're not going to teach them the right way. So discernment, courage, and family, I think, are the primary, on the ground, face-to-face values that repel a lot of this stuff. Then if you want to get more involved, great. Please don't actually get involved at all if you're not discerning. If you don't know what's going on, shut up. Just go learn. Just stop. You're not helping. Oh my gosh, please stop. We have enough of that, and it's enough of a problem. Get your Jordan Peterson. Set your room in order before you try to change the world. Please listen
Absolutely.
to that.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to tell my listeners where they can find you. You're on X prolifically. It's very entertaining and educational. Your New Discourses website has a ton of information. My favorite part is the social justice. Is it the encyclopedia? All the terms, things I never knew existed. It's mind-boggling, but you've got a very deep and informative podcast. If people want to get more educated on any of these things, the New Discourses podcast is really good. And then you also have the Bullets, which is the very short, easy version for people who are just getting their toe in the water. And then besides Marxification of Education, you have written Race Marxism, The Queering of the American Child.
Which is actually about education too, by the way.
Yes,
so
that
one rehashes the education stuff and frankly is easier to understand if you need a first dip.
Yeah. We didn't even talk about Drag Queen Story Hour, which is in this book that we talked about today. Anyway, and then Cynical Theories is a very enlightening book when you just are trying to figure out this whole critical theory stuff. My gosh, eye-opening stuff. But anyway, if you really want to learn more and do the education part, this is the place to start with James's work. And I so appreciate you coming on today. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. This has been great.
Thank you for listening to my podcast today. If you want more content like this, you can go to my website at nickitruesdell.com. That's NICKITRUESDELL.com. And find me on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.
You're listening to the Biblical Family Network.